Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When a reclusive geologist returns to his mountain cabin, he discovers a luxury pavilion being built on his land without permission. What follows is a battle of forged papers, corporate lies, and one man's relentless fight to reclaim what's rightfully his. The gravel crackled beneath my tires as I made the final bend around the ridge. Late afternoon sun filtered through the oaks, casting long shadows across the switchback trail I carved out 2 summers ago with nothing but a chainsaw, a rented bulldozer, and a stubborn refusal to let nature, or bureaucracy, win. I hadn't been up here in over 8 weeks, not since I flew out to Utah to help catalog some volcanic core samples for the survey division. My cabin had waited patiently for my return, nestled at the base of the granite bluff I called my back porch. Or at least, I thought it had. The first thing I noticed was the glint of metal where there should have been nothing but brush and rock. A strange rectangular shape jutted up from the slope just west of my clearing, 2 stories tall, framed in fresh pine and steel supports, already wearing the skeleton of a pitched roof. At its base, concrete, poured recently, maybe within the last few weeks. Pallets of building materials sat nearby, neatly wrapped in plastic sheeting. Stamped on each one, Alpine View Homes, Lot 18B, Summit Guest Pavilion. I pulled the truck into my usual spot, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment in silence. The mountain air was as clear as ever. The wind carried no trace of diesel or machines. But that thing wasn't a figment. It was real, ugly, and standing smack in the middle of what I knew was my land. I walked over, scanning the site. The structure had gone up fast. Too fast. No posted permit. No construction fence. But someone had driven a temporary road through the underbrush. Gravel pressed into the slope in tire-wide tracks. At the tree line, a cheap plastic sign fluttered on a stake. Future amenity for use by residents of Summit Vista Ridge HOA. I barked out a bitter laugh. HOA, of course. My name is Cody Barcroft. I'm 43. Retired geologist. I bought this 35-acre slice of forest and stone 5 years ago outside of Henderson County, North Carolina, for one reason: to be left the hell alone. No neighbors, no noise, no damn HOAs. The deed's clean, the title's clean, and my name sits comfortably atop every county registry that matters. That's why I knew, even before I pulled out my phone, that whatever the hell this was, it wasn't legal. A few satellite pings later, I pulled up my parcel boundary overlay. The GPS didn't lie. That building was planted a good 40 feet inside my property line. I opened the county's GIS map to double-check. Same story. Lot 18B didn't exist. The nearest HOA, Summit Vista Ridge, sat about half a mile southeast over the ridge. Their boundary ended where the national forest began. My land lay completely outside it, private, rural, untouchable. I drove down to the ranger station in town the next morning. The front desk clerk at the county office gave me a confused look when I asked about new permits near Blue Elk Ridge. "We've got a permit here for a community guest lodge," she said, pulling it up on her monitor. "Filed by the Summit Vista Ridge HOA. Says construction approved under an expanded development plan." She clicked again. "Owner listed as, Cody Barcroft." It took a solid 5 seconds before I could speak. "That's me," I said. "And I sure as hell didn't approve anything." She frowned. "Well, it says here the permit was granted based on a verbal confirmation from the HOA about owner cooperation. No challenges filed, so the building was greenlit by the zoning committee." "Let me guess," I said, throat dry. "They never contacted the actual owner." She just looked uncomfortable and clicked a different tab. "You'll probably want to speak to the HOA directly," she offered weakly. "Looks like the president is listed as Karen Waters." I'd never heard the name before, but it sounded exactly like the kind of person who'd mistake someone else's mountain for a corporate clubhouse. Back at the cabin, I dialed the HOA's listed number. A woman answered, sharp and overly professional, like she'd been waiting for a call she could pretend was a courtesy. "Summit Vista Ridge Association, this is Karen." "This is Cody Barcroft," I said. "You've got a construction crew on my land. I didn't authorize it. You need to stop the project immediately and remove the structure." Silence. Then a chirpy, rehearsed voice. "Mr. Barcroft, our development team assured us that the land was unoccupied and abandoned. There's been a substantial investment already, over $180,000 in materials and contracted work. If there's a disagreement about the parcel, I suggest you speak to your attorney. I don't think you understand, I said, voice tightening. You built a goddamn house on my land. Technically, she replied, we're building a shared-use pavilion for Summit residents. If you'd like to negotiate usage terms or licensing, we're open to solutions. My hands curled into fists around the phone. I'm not negotiating. I want your crews off my property, and I want that structure gone. You have 48 hours. Karen's tone sharpened. We are acting in good faith. If you attempt to interfere with this project, you'll be exposing yourself to legal liability for damages incurred. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. 2 days later, I stood in the clearing again, this time with a drone controller in hand. I flew it up, circled twice, and captured full aerial footage of the build, the foundation, the roads they cut through my forest. Then I sent the files to my lawyer in Asheville, dropped a flash drive in the safe, and opened my old survey documents. They wanted legal liability. They were about to get it. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted when I pulled into the gravel turnout near the ridge, trailer rattling behind my truck. It had taken one phone call and a couple bottles of bourbon to get Dale's crew up here on short notice. Dale Jensen ran a demolition outfit out of Brevard, ex-Army. No questions asked, worked fast, worked clean. I'd used them once before to clear an old Ranger shed full of asbestos and bullet holes. When I told him the job was a 2-story pavilion frame built without permission on private land, he didn't even blink. Sounds like someone's about to get educated, he'd said. We'll bring the big teeth. The county hadn't budged. Even after I dropped the drone footage, GPS overlays, and full deed history into their inbox, their response was a bureaucratic shrug. This appears to be a civil matter between adjacent parties, the clerk had told my lawyer, which, translated from legalese, meant we're not getting involved until someone sues someone else. HOA knew exactly how to play that game, muddy the waters just enough to force the burden of proof onto the real owner, then slow walk every challenge. But I wasn't interested in waiting. By 8 a.m., Dale's guys were swinging sledgehammers into the plywood sheathing. The aluminum roof beams came down like snapped bones, one after another. A rented excavator tore the footings loose from the concrete pad, while a second machine loaded the debris into a tandem dump trailer. Every nail, every board, every cinder block, out. I stood by with my surveyor, Paula, who'd printed out a glossy map with clear GPS overlays and infrared scan alignment. She planted neon flags around the structure's original footprint, just for the record. You sure you want to go through with this without waiting on a court order? She asked me once. It's my land, I said. I don't need a court's permission to remove trespassing junk. Fair point. By sunset, the slope looked almost untouched. Dale had a gift for leaving nothing behind but dirt and a faint smell of diesel. We installed a steel gate across the forest trail with cinder block anchors, poured quick-set cement into the base, and welded a plate for a deadbolt lock. Over the gate, I mounted a black and yellow sign that read, Private Land. Trespassers will be prosecuted. HOA not recognized. That evening, I drove down the mountain, tired but clear-headed. My inbox had exploded. 3 emails from my attorney, 1 voicemail from the county permitting office, and 1 new number I didn't recognize. The last one was Karen. Mr. Barcroft, she said, voice clipped and smug. We've just been informed that you unlawfully destroyed community infrastructure on a designated development parcel. We are filing a civil claim for $600,000 in damages. You'll be receiving a summons shortly. I stared at the phone for a moment, then replayed the message. Not a shred of hesitation in her voice, not even surprise. 2 days later, a process server knocked on my door holding a thick envelope like it was radioactive. Civil summons, Summit Vista Ridge, HOA v. Cody Barcroft. Allegations: destruction of community property, obstruction of development, endangerment of public resources, malicious interference. My lawyer, Adrienne, reviewed the suit and raised an eyebrow. They're going big. They're going insane, I said. They want to scare you, push you to settle. They picked the wrong geologist. By the weekend, the local newspaper had picked up the story. Of course, it was the HOA's version. Headline read, Local man destroys shared mountain pavilion, faces lawsuit. No mention of trespassing. No mention of my name on the deed. Just a photo of the empty slope with a caption, Site where Community Lodge once stood. Worse, HOA's Facebook group had gone into full hysteria mode. Posts painted me as a reclusive prepper who violently demolished a shared asset, potentially endangering hikers. One comment claimed I was stockpiling weapons in a shack off-grid. Another said I had threatened HOA volunteers with a shovel. None of it was true, but I knew the playbook. When you can't win by facts, bury the truth in a mountain of innuendo. And if the public can't see the property line, they'll assume the loudest voice is the honest one. Adrian advised we stay silent for now. Don't fuel their media fire, she said. We'll dismantle their case the same way you dismantled their clubhouse. Clean, legal, permanent. I nodded but didn't sleep much that night. Out here, you expect weather, bears, maybe even wildfires. You don't expect an HOA to invade like termites in a Gucci briefcase. So I started preparing in my own way. I pulled out every survey, deed, tax record, GPS overlay, and drone shot I had. I started calling old colleagues, licensed surveyors, former county assessors, even a retired zoning attorney I met in Yellowstone. I wasn't just going to win this case. I was going to salt the earth they walked on. The first sign that things were about to get messier than a mudslide came from the Henderson County Gazette. Someone slipped a physical copy under my cabin door like a passive-aggressive paperboy delivering shame. The headline glared at me in oversized block letters. Mountain Recluse destroys community project, faces major lawsuit. Below it, a picture of the empty slope where the unauthorized pavilion once stood. The caption helpfully implied that I'd robbed the neighborhood of a beloved public asset. Beloved. It had stood for less than a month. The article quoted several concerned residents of Summit Vista Ridge, each one more dramatic than the last. One woman claimed I had screeched threats at volunteers, though I hadn't spoken to a single person on site except my own surveyor. Another insisted I was known for unstable behavior, citing non-existent police reports and a rumor that I'd once chased a Boy Scout troop off my driveway with a machete. I didn't even own a machete. Yet. The HOA Facebook page had turned into a digital witch burning. I was apparently a survivalist hermit with a bunker full of canned beans and stolen military explosives. A man named Brad with an American flag of I was begging the sheriff's office to remove the danger from the mountains before he snaps. A woman with a profile picture of a golden retriever declared she was too scared to hike anymore. And then there was Karen's official statement, which read like a smear campaign written by an AI trained on real estate brochures and petty tyranny. We attempted to improve the region by making underutilized land accessible to responsible community members. Unfortunately, a radical individual chose destruction and hostility over cooperation and progress. Radical? Sure. If wanting people to stay the hell off your legally owned property made you radical, then paint me bright red and call me Che Guevara. Adrian told me to ignore the noise, but noise has a way of getting under your skin when the nearest human civilization thinks you're a menace. So when I drove down to town for groceries and two people whispered while staring directly at me from the produce aisle, I felt that familiar Yellowstone tightness in my chest, the kind you get when a steam vent hisses unexpectedly beneath your boots. Back at the cabin, I set up the new wildlife cameras along the tree line, each one angled to capture the trail, the slope, and the makeshift road the construction crew had carved. If anyone thought they could sneak back up here to rebuild, they were going to get their faces saved to the cloud and emailed to half a dozen attorneys before they finished unpacking their toolboxes. That afternoon, I called my old colleague and independent survey expert, Greg the Compass Miller. Greg had worked with me on geothermal mapping near Old Faithful, and he had the stubbornness of a bull moose. When I explained what was happening, he let out a low whistle. They messed with the wrong mountain goat, he said. Send me everything. I'll cross-reference the parcel shapes against historic zoning overlays. If they forged anything, I'll sniff it out like a hound on a ham bone. Meanwhile, Adrian filed a cease and desist for defamation and unauthorized land use. She also dropped a press release clarifying that the HOA had built illegally on private property. The local reporter from the Gazette called me within the hour, sounding nervous. We're updating the article, she said. Seems there might be conflicting information. No kidding, I replied, and hung up. But Karen wasn't done. A county land use inspector drove up 2 days later and claimed he needed to verify environmental damages. He insisted there had been reports of hazardous chemicals and runoff contaminating the watershed, which was fascinating considering all we removed was wood and steel. "Who filed those reports?" I asked. He avoided eye contact. "They're confidential." "Confidential my ass." I could practically hear Karen dictating the complaints from her ergonomic HOA throne. The inspector tried to poke around the cabin until I gently reminded him he needed a warrant to so much as breathe in my living room. He backed off, but not before handing me a pink notice stating an investigation was pending. Adrian was furious. "They're trying to trigger enforcement actions to make you look like a county violator. Classic leverage tactic." "Let them dig," I said. "There's nothing to find." Still, it gnawed at me. HOA wasn't just trying to take land, they were trying to rewrite reality. If enough people believed their story, I'd go from landowner to criminal in the public eye before a single judge saw a scrap of evidence. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a new message, an unknown number. A single sentence: "Enjoy what freedom you have left, Cody." That night, a pickup truck rolled slowly past the locked gate at the foot of my trail. It lingered there, headlights off. My new cameras caught it perfectly. White Ford, dented bumper, HOA permit sticker in the windshield. The message was clear enough. They wanted me intimidated into surrender. But intimidation works best on people who care what others think. I'd spent 2 decades sleeping beside boiling mud pits and tectonic fault lines. A Facebook mob and some creeps in a truck weren't going to scare me off my own mountain. They wanted a fight? Fine. I'd give them a war. Greg Miller showed up 3 days later in a dusty Tacoma, a battered drone case in the back seat, and a thermos the size of a fire extinguisher clutched in one hand. He wore the same faded National Park Service cap I remembered from our Yellowstone days, and a grin like he couldn't wait to ruin someone's day. "You bring the bastards to heel yet?" he asked, stepping out and cracking his back. "Not yet," I said. "But they've made themselves comfortable on my nerves." We spent the day flying the drone, running elevation checks, and overlaying parcel boundaries on current satellite imagery. Greg used a LiDAR setup with centimeter accuracy. Fancy stuff for what amounted to proving that a pile of rich suburbanites couldn't read a map. That night, we went through county records together in the cabin. My desktop was covered in scanned zoning overlays, historical topographic maps, and structural permit requests. Around 2 in the morning, Greg froze mid-scroll. "Here," he said, tapping the screen. "This parcel boundary map from 1993. See the issue?" I leaned in. My lot, parcel 19B, was clearly there, but it had no digital signature or owner overlay in the scanned layer, just a blank box. "Looks like it wasn't updated with my deed." "Worse," he said. "Looks like someone pulled this outdated map and used it as the base layer to file their permit. If the HOA submitted this with a falsified signature or fake authorization, they claimed it was undeveloped communal land. You think they doctored the map? No. They cherry-picked an old one with an intentional gap and passed it off as current. That's enough to mislead a lazy permitting officer." I stared at the screen. "So they built on my land, using a 30-year-old ghost map?" "Yep. And if the county didn't verify ownership, that's gross negligence at best. Collusion at worst." Adrienne nearly broke her phone's speaker when I relayed the news. "Send me everything. If that's what they used to get the permit, we've got them on administrative fraud. I want the full chain of custody, every stamp, every email." By the end of the week, we had it. The building permit approval form was signed off by a junior zoning officer named Franklin Terrell, and just as Greg suspected, it listed the owner of parcel 19B as community shared, abandoned, see 1993 overlay, HOA declaration attached. The declaration was a 1-page PDF, unsigned, with no dates and no actual legal basis. But that didn't stop it from getting rubber stamped. Adrian filed a motion to dismiss the HOA's lawsuit based on misrepresentation and filed a cross-complaint for fraudulent development, land trespass, and conspiracy to obtain property by deception. She also formally requested a disciplinary review of zoning staff with the Henderson County Board of Commissioners. That lit the fuse. Karen Waters, HOA president and walking bundle of Botox and bile, called an emergency meeting of the Summit Vista Ridge Board. How do I know? Because someone slipped me the agenda. I'm not naming names, but let's just say not everyone in Summit Vista Ridge was thrilled about watching their HOA spiral into a criminal case. The same day Adrian filed the counterclaim, I received a knock on the door. Not police. Not county officials. A process server with a second lawsuit, this time from Alpine View Homes, the contractor who'd built the pavilion. They were claiming damages for unauthorized demolition of materials and interruption of contractual obligations. Total $278,000. Adrian wasn't even surprised. They're trying to pile pressure, she said. They know they can't win, but they're betting you'll settle to make the noise go away. I asked her what we could do about it. She just smiled. I'm going to subpoena every correspondence between the contractor and the HOA. If they acted without verifying the landowner, they're complicit. And I'll file with the state licensing board. Contractors aren't allowed to build on parcels without ownership validation. If they faked it or skipped it, bye-bye license. She wasn't bluffing. By the following Monday, Alpine View Homes had been hit with a formal complaint to the North Carolina Licensing Board for general contractors, citing unverified land use and willful construction on contested property. Then came the cherry on top. Greg discovered that the HOA had submitted the building plan using a recycled digital signature from another Summit project. Not only that, but the architectural diagram listed a different lot number entirely, something they manually changed before submission. Forgery. Clean, crisp, and traceable. Adrian's assistant contacted a forensic document examiner. The metadata in the PDF was conclusive. The file had been modified using Adobe Acrobat Pro on Karen Waters' personal laptop 3 weeks before construction began. I forwarded the entire package to the sheriff's office and the district attorney. The DA's office acknowledged receipt. Quietly, formally, but it was enough to rattle the nest. That night, Greg and I sat on the porch, sipping from mason jars and watching the tree line. You know, he said, if this was Yellowstone, they'd have just set the whole thing on fire and walked away. I snorted. Yeah, well, here in Carolina, we sue people first. 2 weeks before the court hearing, the Summit turned to avalanche. Adrian got a call from the DA's office. Not a formal statement, but an unofficial heads up. Apparently, they had opened a preliminary investigation into fraud and misconduct within the Summit Vista Ridge HOA. Karen Waters was now officially on the radar for document tampering and administrative coercion. The exact term the assistant DA used was pattern of deceptive activity involving public entities. That's when I knew things were accelerating. Then came the subpoena storm. Adrian filed for full discovery. All email communications between Summit Vista Ridge and Alpine View Homes, zoning correspondence, contractor agreements, and HOA internal memos. What came back was a digital swamp of incompetence and arrogance. Karen had sent emails to her board titled Fast Track Project before off-grid weirdo notices, and no need to involve him. He's never around. There was one thread where she described me as a bearded squatter in a glorified shack. But it wasn't. Just snarky insults that damned her. One attachment was a scanned owner consent form with my name typed at the bottom, authorizing development for community recreation. It was dated 2 weeks before I even returned from my geology trip in Utah. Adrian compared it to a notarized signature from my mortgage refinance in Asheville. Not even close. A handwriting analyst later called it a clumsy copy-paste job using a stylus or digital overlay. Karen had forged my signature. That alone was enough to nuke her case. But she'd also filed it with the county as part of the official record, sworn affidavit stamp and all. Adrian's eyes lit up. We're going to court with a smoking gun and a flamethrower. I didn't have time to feel victorious. A sheriff's deputy showed up at my cabin later that day, not to arrest me, but to serve a protective order. Karen had filed for a temporary restraining order, claiming I had threatened HOA volunteers and that she feared for the safety of community members. It was pure theater. There were no volunteers. No one had ever approached my land besides the unauthorized contractors, but the claim was filed and I had to respond in court. I called Adrian, stunned. Can she do this? She can try, she said, already drafting a response. She's panicking. That means she knows she's losing. At the court hearing for the restraining order, Karen arrived in a designer blazer, clutching a stack of dramatic printed emails and 2 HOA board members in tow. She described me as volatile, militia adjacent, and potentially unhinged. Adrian countered with photos of my cabin, screenshots of my publication history in geological journals, and a live notarized affidavit from my neighbor stating I hadn't even raised my voice since buying the land. The judge dismissed the request in under 10 minutes. That same afternoon, Adrian filed a motion for sanctions against the HOA for abuse of process. It was no longer just a civil land dispute. It was a war of attrition, and Karen had crossed into hostile territory without a map. The court date for the main case, HOA versus Barcroft, was set for Thursday of the following week. I spent the days leading up to it helping Greg and Adrienne prep binders full of evidence, transcriptions of phone calls, drone footage, metadata printouts, and county registrar timelines. Meanwhile, the local press caught wind of the story. It started with a small column in the Henderson County News. Off-grid geologist sued for dismantling community pavilion on his own land. It spiraled from there. A journalist from Channel 8 asked for an interview. I declined. Adrienne, however, did not. She gave a brutal 10-minute segment where she laid out the timeline, forged forms, and contractor negligence. She ended the interview with, "If the HOA wants to run a criminal enterprise, they should have picked a quieter mountain." The fallout was immediate. County officials issued a statement suspending the zoning officer involved, Franklin Terrell, pending internal review. A petition began circulating online to dissolve the Summit Vista Ridge HOA's board. Even the building company, Alpine View Homes, issued a press release distancing themselves from a potentially fraudulent authorization process. 2 nights before court, Greg showed me new drone footage. We'd caught Karen standing in the middle of the slope, screaming into her phone, surrounded by tarps and bundled insulation, clearly trying to salvage materials. At one point, she kicked a concrete post and nearly fell down the hill. Greg looked at me and said, "You're not going to court. You're going to a funeral." The morning of the trial was unnaturally clear, that kind of crisp North Carolina mountain sky that feels like it's watching. Adrienne had told me to wear something respectable but unassuming. I settled on dark jeans, boots, and a button-down I hadn't worn since my retirement dinner. At the courthouse, we were greeted by a line of people outside. Residents, reporters, a few bloggers with press badges that looked homemade. Someone had printed out my face from an old geology conference and photoshopped a superhero cape on it. I tried not to laugh. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table in a coral blazer with shoulder pads sharp enough to slice meat. Her attorney, a hunched man in a too shiny suit named Victor Halperin, shuffled papers like he was building a nest. On our side, Adrian was calm, composed, deadly. Greg sat behind us with his laptop and what looked like a binder full of receipts, photos, and affidavits. We had more evidence than a police precinct. Karen had a dream, a tantrum, and a forged signature. The judge was a seasoned woman named Marion Whitley, sharp eyes, no time for nonsense. When Karen's side opened with claims of community disruption, destruction of recreational property, and psychological damage to the HOA, Judge Whitley raised a brow so high it nearly left orbit. Then it was our turn. Adrienne didn't waste time. She opened with the deed, my deed, notarized, filed, uncontested. She projected it on the screen with the registrar's certification stamp. Then she brought out the forged consent form Karen had submitted and compared it to the original signature from my property transfer. The handwriting analyst's statement followed, then the zoning emails, the ones where HOA members casually discussed starting construction before anyone notices. We showed the drone footage, the unauthorized equipment, the dates and timestamps. The timeline of my absence, a physical timeline board was wheeled in like we were on a crime show. Greg handed out copies of inspection records, zoning requests, and building permit applications that made it abundantly clear. At no point was I ever consulted, notified, or involved. Karen squirmed. Then came the highlight, the sworn affidavit from a whistleblower, a junior zoning clerk named Emily Watson, who claimed Karen had approached their office directly and pressured Franklin Terrell to approve the permit under the table, citing emergency community needs. Emily testified that she overheard Karen say, "No one lives there. It's ours now, basically." Adrienne asked her how she felt about that. Emily answered, "Sick to my stomach." Victor Halperin tried to object, but Judge Whitley was done playing referee. She called a recess. We stepped outside. Local news reporters swarmed. Adrienne gave a curt, "No comment," and I followed her lead. Karen, however, couldn't help herself. She pulled out a printed statement about protecting the vision of Summit Vista Ridge and how outsiders can't understand planned growth. It didn't go over well. One reporter asked her point blank, "Did you forge the homeowner's consent?" She stumbled, denied, and then muttered something about delegated responsibility. Back inside, the final hour was a parade of consequences. The judge grilled Karen about the forged documents. Karen claimed she didn't remember signing off personally and blamed clerical miscommunication. Adrian calmly pointed out that Karen's name appeared on 6 different filings, 3 of which were submitted under penalty of perjury. Judge Whitley leaned forward and said, "Are you accusing the county registrar's system of conspiracy?" Karen went silent. The final blow came when Adrian presented a breakdown of costs: demolition, cleanup, legal fees, emotional distress, property defacement. Greg played a final drone video of the lot before, during, and after the unauthorized construction with a date-stamped commentary overlay. Judge Whitley closed her folder. "I'm reserving my formal ruling until tomorrow morning. But let me be clear, based on the evidence presented, the actions of Summit Vista Ridge HOA, particularly those of Ms. Waters, appear to be fraudulent, reckless, and an egregious abuse of process." Karen's jaw twitched. "Back at the cabin, I lit a fire for the first time in weeks." Adrian called to say the judge's written opinion would be ready by 10 a.m. tomorrow. Greg opened a bottle of something that looked expensive and unlabeled, handed me a glass, and toasted, "To the rock that didn't move." I didn't sleep much that night. Not from nerves, but from the sense that something final was about to fall into place. At sunrise, I brewed strong coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the mist slither between the trees like smoke from an old war I hadn't realized I'd been fighting. By 9:30, I was pulling into the courthouse lot again, flanked by reporters and curious locals who had apparently cleared their calendars for this little legal drama. Adrienne met me outside with a tight smile. "You ready for the fireworks?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Inside, the courtroom was packed again, but the mood had shifted. Karen sat alone at the plaintiff's table. No Halperin in sight. Her coral blazer had been replaced by a gray suit, one size too large, and her eyes were shadowed with the kind of fatigue that comes from watching a tower you built start to fall brick by brick. Judge Whitley entered at exactly 10. No gavel needed. The room hushed on instinct. She opened a binder, adjusted her glasses, and began reading the ruling. Her voice was measured, but each word landed like a small, deliberate detonation. The court finds that the construction on Mr. Barcroft's property was undertaken without his knowledge, consent, or legal authorization. The permits submitted by Summit Vista Ridge HOA were based on falsified information, forged documents, and coercive manipulation of zoning officials. Karen shifted in her seat. Moreover, the plaintiff, having been notified of the illegality of the construction, continued to pursue a narrative of rightful ownership and damages, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. My chest tightened as the judge paused, scanning the room. It is the opinion of this court that Mr. Barcroft acted within his legal rights to remove unauthorized structures from his land. The demolition was not only justified, it was necessary. Gasps echoed from the gallery. I didn't flinch. Therefore, the plaintiff's claim for damages is denied in full. Additionally, the court awards Mr. Barcroft $920,000 in compensation to cover legal expenses, restoration costs, and damages related to emotional distress and reputational harm. Karen's jaw dropped, but Whitley wasn't done. This court also refers Ms. Karen Waters for criminal investigation on charges of perjury, document forgery, abuse of administrative processes, and attempted unlawful seizure of private land. For a full 5 seconds, there was silence. Then a deputy approached Karen's table and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't resist, just stared at the wood grain of the desk like it might offer her a way out if she stared hard enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but Adrienne shielded me from most of it. No public statements until after sentencing, she warned. Greg, however, handed out thumb drives to media with selected exhibits and drone footage. Let the footage speak, he said. And, oh, it did. By the end of the day, Summit Vista Ridge HOA was trending online for all the wrong reasons. The HOA that built on the wrong hill, Karen's mountain meltdown, and my personal favorite, geologist says not on my rock, wins big. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, recovery, and cleanup. Karen was formally arrested on 4 felony counts. Halperin vanished into the fog of legal damage control. The HOA board voted to remove her entirely. A formality, really, since the state appointed a receiver to take over operations. The new acting director called me, apologized profusely, and promised they'd be sending workers to remove the access road and finish clearing the slope. I told them I'd handle it myself. I trusted bulldozers more than HOA promises. At the cabin, I finally exhaled. The concrete scars were still visible where the foundation had been, but they didn't feel like wounds anymore. They felt like warnings and lessons. I had Greg install 2 new cameras, one pointing at the ridge trail, the other toward the old roadbed. On the boulders near the overlook, I painted a simple sign in red letters. Private land, no HOA, not now, not ever. That night, I lit a fire, poured myself a stiff drink, and watched the flames chew through dry pine. Adrian texted me, "Want to file for punitive damages next month?" I replied, "Nah, I'm good. Let it burn where it belongs." The snow came early that year. By mid-November, the ridge was already dusted in white, and the mornings started with ice fog drifting like ghosts through the trees. I'd sealed up the cabin, winterized the pipes, and hauled the last load of firewood up the trail by hand. I didn't mind the work. It kept my head clear and my hands honest. After everything, I found comfort in the rhythm of simple tasks. The legal storm had settled, but the aftershocks still rippled through the county. Karen Waters had been denied bail after investigators found she'd tried to bribe a zoning clerk to misplace county records. During a preliminary hearing, she broke down crying when the judge read the full list of charges. 15 years was on the table, and no one was offering her a deal. Turns out, you can't lie your way out of felony fraud when the other side has drone footage, notarized maps, and half the county ready to testify against you. Summit Vista Ridge HOA didn't fare much better. The state board assigned an external audit team who unearthed a litany of irregularities, missing budgets, fake fines, emergency special assessments paid directly into an LLC. Karen quietly ran from a P.O. box in Asheville. Homeowners revolted. Several filed lawsuits of their own. One guy, a retired Army colonel, called me and said, "Buddy, I don't know who you are, but you just saved us all from that lunatic." They renamed the HOA within the month. Summit Community Cooperative, now run by a temporary board of volunteers and, reportedly, under threat of dissolution if anything sketchy happened again. I stayed far away. That circus was behind me. As for my land, I fenced off the lower trailhead and planted native shrubs along the old access road until it disappeared back into the slope. Where the illegal house once stood, I built a stone fire pit. Nothing fancy, just a circle of boulders and gravel with a log bench. Tourists sometimes hike up from the trail network below, and I don't mind them resting there. I put up a sign, "Welcome to Dead Foundation Overlook." Sit, breathe, and think before you build. I even started hosting small geology talks once a month, mostly retired hikers, backpackers, the odd homeschool group. I show them how the rock face near the stream formed during the tectonic orogeny, and they nod like I'm revealing the bones of the earth. I guess, in a way, I am. It feels good to talk about something deeper than lawsuits and trespass notices. My memoir's coming along, too. Chapter 7 is titled, "When the HOA Tried to Annex a Geologist." Adrian wants me to sell the rights. Apparently, someone at Netflix emailed her. I told her maybe if they cast Jeff Bridges. I still get mail about the case. Some from people asking how to fight their own HOA nightmares. Others just to say thanks. One woman from Arizona wrote, "Your story gave me the guts to stand up for my mother's land." They backed off after I showed them your court filings. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to drink coffee and watch fog crawl up a mountain. The sign at the edge of my driveway is still there. Private property. No HOA. Under any circumstances. Beneath it, I added a smaller plaque last week. Black slate, etched in silver. Here stood a stolen house. Here stood a liar. Now only stone. Now only sky. I don't know if anyone reads it but me. But I do read it. Every time I come home.